The fuel hose disconnected with a metallic click that James Swett would remember for the rest of his life. April 7th, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. 22 years old. Hands still calloused from working in his father's machine shop back in San Francisco. First combat mission. He'd never fired his guns in anger. Never seen an enemy aircraft except in grainy training films. Never experienced the chaos that was about to erupt across the sky above the Solomon Islands. Then the radio crackled. 2 words that stopped every heart on that muddy airstrip. Condition red. Pause. Condition very red. 150 Japanese aircraft approaching from the north. The largest enemy air raid since Pearl Harbor was minutes away. Standing between those bombers and the American fleet were 76 Allied fighters scrambling desperately for altitude. And somewhere in that desperate scramble was a former pump mechanic who had absolutely no idea he was about to become a legend. What none of the Japanese pilots knew as they approached in their carefully orchestrated formations, what none of them could have possibly anticipated, was that they were about to encounter something that would defy every assumption about combat aviation. Not superior technology, not overwhelming numbers, something far more dangerous. Natural talent, meeting precise, training meeting pure instinct in a combination that would produce 15 minutes nobody would ever forget. The ground crew was still pumping fuel into Swett's Grumman F4F Wildcat when the alert sounded. Bureau number Attentutini 84. He'd just landed from a routine patrol 30 minutes earlier. Tank still half empty. The young Marine was standing beside his fighter, stretching cramped legs, thinking about nothing more complicated than getting some water when everything changed. The operations officer made an instant decision that would alter the course of Swett's entire life. Launch everything. Partially fueled aircraft were better than aircraft caught on the ground and blown to pieces. Ground crews shouted at him to mount up. The fuel hose was yanked from his wing tank, spilling precious gasoline across the pierced steel planking. Around him, 76 Allied fighters were clawing for the sky. Wildcats, Corsairs, P-40 Warhawks, P-38 Lightnings, P-39 era Cobras. Every fighter within range being thrown into the air to face what intelligence was calling an absolute nightmare scenario. 177 Japanese aircraft, 67 Valdive bombers, 110 Zero fighters. The kind of numbers that made veteran pilots go pale. Swett climbed into his cockpit with hands that should have been shaking but somehow weren't. Later, he'd wonder about that. Why wasn't he terrified? Why wasn't he paralyzed by the knowledge that experienced pilots with hundreds of combat hours were about to face the largest air battle in Pacific history? And here he was, a pump mechanic from San Mateo with zero combat experience, about to join them? But in that moment, there was no time for fear. Only checklist, instruments, fuel gauge reading barely half full, ammunition counters showing full load, 1,440 rounds, 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, 18 to 20 seconds of sustained fire if he needed it. He advanced the throttle. The Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engine roared to full power, 1,200 horsepower pulling the Wildcat forward. The fighter accelerated slowly, heavily loaded, using every foot of that short runway to gain flying speed. At 70 miles per hour, Swett pulled back on the stick. The Wildcat lifted reluctantly into the tropical air. He raised his landing gear by hand, cranking the retraction handle 30 times to fold the wheels into their wing recesses. Right hand off the throttle for 30 seconds while his left hand flew the aircraft. Exhausting procedure during the most critical moment after takeoff. But every Wildcat pilot had done it hundreds of times. Once airborne, Swett joined with his 3 wingmen and began the desperate climb for altitude. Japanese dive bombers would approach at 15 to 20,000 feet. American fighters needed to reach that altitude or higher, or they'd be useless. The Wildcat climbed slowly, painfully slowly for pilots who knew the enemy was approaching at 300 miles per hour, 1,800 feet per minute in combat conditions. Reaching 15,000 feet required nearly 9 minutes. 9 minutes that felt like 9 hours. Around him, the sky filled with climbing American fighters, all clawing for altitude, all racing against time they didn't have. Below, Swett could see the waters north of Guadalcanal. Tulagi Harbor contained American ships, 3 cruisers, several destroyers, cargo vessels, tankers, auxiliaries, thousands of American sailors who had absolutely no idea that 177 Japanese aircraft were approaching to destroy them. The radio net crackled with reports. Coast watchers tracking the raid, fighter directors coordinating the intercept, pilots reporting positions and altitudes. The controlled chaos of aerial warfare in 1943, before sophisticated radar, before modern command and control, when everything depended on eyeballs and voice radio and luck. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, at 14,000 feet altitude over the Russell Islands, Swett spotted them, dark specks against the blue sky to the northwest, growing rapidly larger. His breath caught. Dozens of aircraft in tight formation, more than he'd ever seen, more than he'd imagined possible. The entire Japanese raid stretching across miles of sky, organized into precise elements, approaching with terrifying determination like some kind of mechanical apocalypse. Swett keyed his radio microphone. His voice came out steady, showing none of the fear clenching his stomach like a fist. Tally-ho, bandits 12 o'clock high. Multiple bogeys. Fighter director acknowledged immediately. All fighters engage. Good hunting. That was it. No elaborate tactics. No careful coordination. Just engage. 76 American fighters against 177 Japanese aircraft. The mathematics were brutal. The mission was clear. Swett rolled his Wildcat into a steep diving turn, positioning for an attack on the dive bombers. His wingmen followed, maintaining formation discipline despite the chaos erupting around them. Below and ahead, he could see the Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers in neat formations. Single-engine aircraft, each carrying a crew of 2 and a 1,000-pound bomb. They were obsolescent, slow, vulnerable, but deadly if they reached their targets. And right now, they were headed straight for American ships filled with American sailors who were depending on fighters they couldn't see to stop bombers they didn't know were coming. Swett selected 3 Vals that had separated slightly from the main formation. He positioned his division above and behind them, setting up for a classic overhead diving attack. The Japanese rear gunners would see him coming, but would have difficulty tracking a target diving at high speed. Training kicked in. Everything his instructors had drilled into him. Stay fast, aim carefully, short bursts, conserve ammunition, use your wingman, never turn with a zero. At 350 miles per hour, Swett pulled out of his dive directly behind the trailing Val. The Japanese aircraft filled his gun sight, growing from a small silhouette to a clearly defined target in seconds. Range close to 200 yards. 150. 100. Swett pressed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. The sound was deafening even through his leather helmet. The Wildcat shuddered from recoil. Tracers reached out toward the Val like fingers of fire. The first burst struck the Val's fuselage and left wing. Pieces of metal tore away from the Japanese bomber. The rear gunner stopped firing. The Val began smoking, then burning. Then it exploded in midair. A ball of orange flame that had been an aircraft 1 second ago. First kill. Swett had no time to think. No time to process what he'd just done. No time to feel anything about the 2 men who'd just died. He was already lining up the second Val, which was desperately trying to evade. The Japanese pilot dove toward the water. Swett followed, keeping his Wildcat positioned behind and slightly above, firing short, precise bursts. The second Val caught fire and went down. 2 kills in less than 30 seconds. Swett pulled up hard, looking for the third Val. The Japanese pilot had seen his companions destroyed and was attempting to escape. Swett climbed after him, using energy from his dive to maintain pursuit. The Val was slow, barely 200 miles per hour in level flight. The Wildcat closed steadily. At 100 yards, Swett fired a long burst. The Val exploded, raining debris into the ocean below. 3 enemy aircraft destroyed in his first 90 seconds of combat. 3 bombers that would never reach American ships. 3,000-pound bombs that would never fall on American sailors. But Swett had become separated from his division during the attack. His wingmen had engaged different targets and were now scattered across the sky. He found himself alone in the middle of the largest air battle in the Pacific War to date. As Swett climbed back toward the main engagement, American anti-aircraft fire from the ships below opened up on everything in the sky. The gunners couldn't distinguish between American and Japanese aircraft at altitude. They fired at everything that moved, filling the air with exploding shells and shrapnel. A burst of anti-aircraft fire detonated near Swett's left wing, close enough that he felt the concussion through the airframe. Shrapnel punctured the wing surface and damaged the aileron. The Wildcat suddenly became harder to control, requiring constant pressure on the stick to maintain level flight. A less experienced pilot might have disengaged, headed home, called it a day. Swett checked his instruments. Oil pressure steady, engine temperature normal. Flight controls still responding, despite the wing damage. He was still combat capable. The decision took seconds. He would continue fighting. Nobody was ordering him to stay. Nobody would have blamed him for leaving. But there were still Japanese bombers in the sky and American ships in the harbor. And as long as his fighter could fly, he would fight. Ahead and below, Swett spotted a formation of 6 more Vals approaching Tulagi Harbor for their attack run. These bombers were flying in loose line-astern formation, following each other toward the target. They'd been separated from their fighter escort by the ferocious American interception and now flew unprotected. Vulnerable. Swett dove on them. The Japanese pilots never saw him coming. Diving from above and behind with the sun at his back, Swett approached the last bomber in the line. He closed to less than 100 yards before opening fire. The Val exploded instantly, its bomb detonating from the gunfire. Swett flew through the debris cloud, his windscreen temporarily obscured by smoke and fragments. He pulled up slightly, acquired the next target, fired another burst. The second Val burst into flames and fell away. Swett worked his way up the line methodically, firing short, controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, making every bullet count. Each Val he destroyed was one less bomb falling on American ships. The fourth Val took more hits to destroy. Swett's ammunition was running low and his bursts were shorter. He closed to less than 50 yards, close enough to see the Japanese rear gunner firing desperately at him, close enough to see the tracers streaking past his canopy, close enough to see the terrified face of the pilot looking back over his shoulder. Swett fired until the Val caught fire and fell toward the ocean. 4 more kills, bringing his total to 7 enemy aircraft destroyed. 7. Swett was now officially an ace. 5 or more aerial victories. He'd achieved it in a single combat lasting approximately 15 minutes. It was an almost unprecedented achievement. But Swett wasn't finished. Ahead, he spotted 1 more Val attempting to reach the ships. The Japanese pilot was flying at wave-top altitude. Low and fast, desperate, Swett dove after him, his damaged Wildcat responding sluggishly to control inputs. He closed on the Val from behind and above, lined up the shot, pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. Click, click. His guns were empty. 1,440 rounds of ammunition expended in approximately 15 minutes of combat. 8 kills. But now he faced an enemy bomber with no ammunition remaining. Most pilots would have disengaged at this point. Without ammunition, a fighter was defenseless. The tactically sound decision was to return to base. Rearm. Rejoin the battle. James Swett made a different choice. He continued his attack on the Val despite having no ammunition, flying directly at the Japanese bomber in an attempt to intimidate the pilot into breaking off his attack run. Maybe force him to jettison his bomb. Maybe scare him enough to turn away. It was desperate. It was reckless. It was also the only option Swett could see. That bomber was carrying 1,000 pounds of high explosive meant for American sailors. As long as his fighter could fly, he would try to stop it. The Val's rear gunner was not intimidated. He fired burst after burst at the approaching Wildcat. Bullets struck Swett's aircraft repeatedly. The windscreen shattered from multiple hits. Glass fragments slashed across Swett's face, cutting his cheek, his forehead. Blood ran down into his eyes, partially blinding him. His engine began making rough sounds as Japanese bullets found critical components. Oil pressure began dropping. Temperature began rising. The oil cooler had been hit, damaged by the Val's defensive fire. The Pratt & Whitney engine that had performed flawlessly throughout the mission was dying. Swett broke off the attack and turned toward Henderson Field, hoping to make it back before his engine seized. The Wildcat shuddered and bucked as the engine misfired. Black smoke streamed from the cowling. Oil covered his windscreen, further reducing visibility already compromised by blood and the shattered canopy. He was 15 miles from Henderson Field, flying a heavily damaged aircraft, bleeding from facial wounds, with an engine that could fail completely at any second. Below him was Tulagi Harbor and Florida Island. If his engine failed, he would have to ditch in the water. Ditching near the harbor meant he might be rescued quickly. Ditching in the open ocean meant probable death. The engine made the decision for him. With a grinding shriek of metal on metal, the Pratt & Whitney seized. The propeller stopped, and the Wildcat became a glider. Swett had perhaps 2 minutes of flight time remaining before he would hit the water. He trimmed the aircraft for best glide speed, approximately 110 miles per hour. Looked for a suitable ditching location. The water near Florida Island looked reasonably calm. No large waves visible. If he could execute a proper ditching, if the Wildcat didn't cartwheel or break apart on impact, he might survive. Might. The final seconds before impact required perfect technique. Everything his instructors had taught him about water landings. Everything he'd practiced in training, but never actually done for real. Swett lowered his landing gear manually to act as a water brake, opened his canopy to ensure he could exit quickly, tightened his shoulder harness to prevent being thrown forward on impact. Then he prepared to fly the aircraft into the water at precisely the correct angle and speed. Too steep, and the Wildcat would nose under and sink instantly. Too shallow, and it would skip and tumble and break apart. The correct angle was perhaps 5 degrees nose up, touching down at minimum controlled airspeed, 50 feet altitude. Swett pulled back slightly on the stick, bleeding off the last excess speed. 40 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet. The Wildcat's tail touched water first. Exactly as intended. The aircraft decelerated violently as drag increased. Swett was thrown forward against his shoulder straps with crushing force despite having them tightened. His face smashed into the instrument panel, breaking his nose with an audible crack. Pain exploded across his face like nothing he'd ever experienced. The Wildcat settled into the water and immediately began sinking. The heavy engine pulled the nose down. Water rushed into the cockpit through the open canopy. Swett needed to exit the aircraft within seconds or he would be dragged down with it. He reached for his seatbelt buckle with fingers slippery with blood. The buckle released. He pushed himself upward out of the seat. His parachute harness caught on something inside the cockpit. He was trapped. Water was rising rapidly, already up to his chest. Cold seawater mixed with blood from his facial wounds. Stinging. Burning. Swett yanked desperately at the parachute harness, trying to free himself. The harness remained caught. The Wildcat was sinking faster now, pulling him down. Water reached his chin, his mouth, his nose. He was underwater, still trapped in the sinking fighter, drowning in 10 feet of water after surviving 15 minutes of intense aerial combat. His lungs burned for air. His vision began to darken. Swett gave one final desperate heave, pulling with every ounce of strength remaining. The parachute harness tore free. He pushed himself up and out of the cockpit, swimming desperately toward the surface he could no longer see. His life vest should have inflated automatically, but hadn't. Perhaps damaged by shrapnel. Perhaps fouled by the parachute harness. He couldn't reach the surface. His lungs were empty. His muscles were failing. Then, miraculously, his life vest inflated. The compressed gas cartridge that had failed initially suddenly activated. The vest expanded instantly, providing buoyancy that rocketed Swett toward the surface. He broke through, gasping, choking, sucking in air with desperate heaves. Blood and seawater ran down his face. His nose throbbed with agonizing pain. His face burned from the lacerations. His chest ached from the impact against his harness. But he was alive. He had survived. Around him, the air battle continued. Aircraft dove and climbed overhead. Guns chattered. Bombs exploded in the harbor. Ships fired anti-aircraft weapons in continuous barrage. Within 15 minutes of Swett reaching the surface, a Coast Guard rescue boat spotted him floating in his life vest. The crew pulled him aboard, gave him morphine for the pain, treated his wounds as best they could with combat first aid supplies. Someone handed him a bottle of Scotch whiskey. He drank gratefully, feeling the alcohol burn down his throat, warming his shocked system. The Coast Guard boat delivered him to Tulagi Harbor. He was transferred to the Naval Hospital at Guadalcanal. Doctors examined him, cleaned and stitched his facial lacerations, set his broken nose, checked for internal injuries. Remarkably, aside from the facial wounds and nose fracture, Swett was essentially unhurt. No broken bones except the nose. No internal damage. The morphine dulled the pain to a manageable level. After treatment and initial recovery over the following days, Swett received visits from squadron mates and intelligence officers. Multiple witnesses had observed his attacks on the VAL formations. Other pilots confirmed seeing his repeated diving attacks. Anti-aircraft crews on the ships had watched his sustained assault on the enemy bombers. The intelligence officer's assessment was unequivocal. Second Lieutenant James Elms Swett had destroyed 7 enemy aircraft confirmed in his first combat mission. 7. The number seemed impossible. Veterans with months of combat experience had fewer kills. Here was a pilot who'd never fired his guns in combat before that morning, who'd landed from a routine patrol with half-empty fuel tanks, who'd been standing beside his fighter stretching his legs when the alert sounded. And in 15 minutes of combat, he'd destroyed 7 enemy aircraft, become an ace, been shot down, nearly drowned, and survived. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Naval Aviation Forces in the South Pacific, personally nominated Swett for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation would proceed through channels, but Mitcher's nominations were rarely rejected. After recovering sufficiently, Swett returned to VMF 221 and resumed flying operations. The squadron was converting from F4F Wildcats to the newer F4U Corsair, a significantly more capable fighter. Swett checked out in the Corsair during a brief rest period in Australia and returned to combat in May, June 30th, 1943, now promoted to First Lieutenant. Swett provided air cover for the Allied landings at Rendover Island. During that mission, he shot down 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty medium bombers and shared credit for destroying a Zero fighter with another pilot. 11 days later, July 11th, near New Georgia Island, Swett shot down 2 more Bettys while defending his wingman from attacking Zeros, then destroyed a Zero pursuing his wingman's Corsair, preventing what would have been a certain kill. But Swett failed to see a second Zero positioning behind him. The Japanese pilot's cannon fire struck Swett's Corsair, damaging the engine and fuel system. For the second time in 3 months, James Swett found himself attempting an emergency landing. This time there was no Coast Guard boat nearby. He was over open water, far from friendly forces. Engine losing power, leaking fuel. He managed to ditch the Corsair successfully, exiting the cockpit without major injury, inflated his life raft, floated alone in enemy-controlled waters, hoping for rescue before Japanese forces found him. 2 local Solomon Islanders in a small canoe spotted Swett several hours later. Native islanders who served as scouts for Australian coast watchers. They pulled Swett into their canoe and paddled him to their village. From there, he was transported by a larger 10-man canoe for several hours to reach an Australian Coast Watcher station hidden in the jungle. The Coast Watcher coordinated with Allied command for Swett's evacuation. A PBY Catalina flying boat landed in a sheltered bay the next day and retrieved him. He was returned to the Russell Islands, exhausted but uninjured. The Coast Watcher network and local islanders had saved countless Allied lives during the Pacific War. Swett owed his life to their courage. The islanders received compensation of $14 worth of calico cloth and canned beef, modest payment that Swett later said was inadequate recognition for saving his life. October 1943, Swett flew missions over Bougainville, engaging Japanese aircraft defending the major airbase at Kahili. He shot down 1 Zero confirmed and damaged another probable kill. November brought 2 more Val dive bombers to his tally. He also engaged a Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony fighter, though intelligence officers could only confirm it as probable rather than confirmed destruction. By December 1943, James Swett had flown 103 combat missions and accumulated 15 confirmed aerial victories. He was 23 years old. On October 10, 1943, while Swett was still in the combat zone, Major General Ralph J. Mitchell, commanding the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, presented First Lieutenant James Elms Swett with the Medal of Honor at a ceremony held at Espiritu Santo. The Attache citation recognized his extraordinary heroism on April 7, 1943, when he unhesitatingly led his division against a superior force of enemy bombers, personally destroyed 3 aircraft during his initial dive, then boldly attacked 6 additional enemy bombers after being separated from his division, shooting down 4 more despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and return fire from the bombers that damaged his aircraft, shattered his windscreen, and wounded him before he successfully ditched his fighter in the waters off Tulagi. the Marine Corps decided Swett needed rest. He departed the combat zone on December 11, 1943, arrived in San Francisco on December 31st, was assigned to Marine Corps Air Station Santa Barbara, California, to train new pilots preparing for Pacific deployment. Spring 1944. First Lieutenant Swett traveled to Washington and met President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the White House during a ceremony honoring Medal of Honor recipients. Roosevelt, who had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, asked informed questions about the Corsair and combat tactics. Swett found the president genuinely interested. The meeting lasted 20 minutes, far longer than scheduled, because Roosevelt kept asking follow-up questions about Pacific air combat. By late 1944, Swett was assigned to Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, California, where VMF 221 was training for Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Japan, scheduled for November 1945. The squadron was equipped with F4U4 Corsairs and assigned to provide close air support for landing forces. Every pilot knew Operation Olympic would be the bloodiest campaign in history. Then in August 1945, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. Operation Olympic was cancelled. VMF 221 had ended the war, ranked second among all Marine squadrons with 185 confirmed aerial victories. After the war, Swett commanded Marine Fighting Squadron 141 Flying Corsairs at Naval Air Station Alameda, California. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, VMF 141 was deployed to Korea, but Swett was left behind. The Navy had made a policy decision that Medal of Honor recipients were too valuable to risk in combat. Swett protested vigorously, arguing that he should lead his squadron. The Navy was unmoved. Frustrated, Swett left active duty around 1950 and continued service in the Marine Corps Reserve. He would eventually retire in 1970 with the rank of colonel, having served 29 years. Swett returned to San Francisco and went to work in his father's company manufacturing marine pumps and turbines. The business George Elms Swett had founded in 1920 was still operating, still building the essential machinery that kept maritime industry functioning. James, now Colonel Swett in the reserves, returned to the machine shop he had left 12 years earlier. The calluses on his hands, worn smooth during his years of flying, gradually returned as he worked with pumps and valves and turbines. In 1960, George Swett died and James inherited the company. For the next 23 years, he ran the business his father had built, maintaining the same commitment to quality engineering that had sustained the company through the Depression and war years. He eventually passed the business to his son, continuing the family tradition. The pump company remained modest but profitable, providing steady employment and reliable products. Swett moved to Trinity Center, California in retirement. Later, relocating to Redding, he became a frequent speaker at schools where he shared not combat stories, but rather his beliefs about personal values, respect, responsibility, citizenship. He talked about the importance of doing your job well, supporting your teammates, maintaining your equipment properly. He rarely discussed killing enemy pilots. When students asked about combat, he emphasized teamwork and training rather than individual heroics. His message focused on duty, preparation, collective effort. In 2006, the History Channel produced an episode of their series Dogfights recreating Swett's April 7, 1943 mission using computer graphics. Swett provided commentary for the episode, describing his actions with the same matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing mechanical engineering. The episode aired on November 24, 2006, introduced Swett's story to a new generation. Younger viewers found it difficult to reconcile the elderly man speaking calmly about the mission with the intense, computer-generated combat they watched on screen. But that was precisely who James Swett had been throughout his life, a man who did extraordinary things without considering them extraordinary. January 18, 2009. Colonel James Elms. Swett died in a Reading hospital from heart failure after a lengthy illness. He was 88 years old, survived by his family, his legacy, and the memory of 15 minutes that had transformed an industrial worker into a legend. He was buried with full military honors at Northern California Veterans Cemetery in Igo, California. The funeral was attended by hundreds. Surviving members of VMF 221, fellow Medal of Honor recipients, representatives from the Marine Corps and Navy, fighter aircraft performed a missing man formation flyover. A Marine Honor Guard fired a 21-gun salute. Taps echoed across the cemetery grounds. The American flag that had draped. His coffin was folded with military precision and presented to his family. The story of James Elm Swett illuminates profound truths about heroism and the character of the men who won World War II. Swett was not a professional warrior descended from military tradition or educated at elite academies. He was a working-class young man from the San Francisco Bay Area who happened to possess natural flying ability and unshakable courage. His story was replicated thousands of times across the Pacific Theater. Farmers became tank commanders. Shopkeepers became bombardiers. Factory workers became submariners. America took ordinary citizens and transformed them into a military force that defeated professional armies that had trained for decades. The transformation was systematic and thorough, based on principles America understood instinctively. Provide excellent training. Supply the best equipment possible. Trust individuals to make decisions. Reward initiative and aggressive action. These principles, anathema to authoritarian military systems, produced combat effectiveness that totalitarian regimes couldn't match. The American military system produced thousands of skilled pilots and soldiers who performed at levels enemy commanders considered impossible. James Swett shot down 7 Japanese aircraft on his first mission not because he was superhuman, but because he was superbly trained, adequately equipped, and trusted to use his initiative. The decision to press an attack without ammunition was his alone, made in seconds, based on training and instinct. This individual initiative, this assumption of personal responsibility without requiring permission, it characterized American combat effectiveness throughout the war. Technology and training created opportunities for victory, but individual courage remained essential. Comparing production statistics reveals the industrial disparity that shaped the Pacific War's outcome. During World War II, the United States produced approximately 324,000 aircraft of all types. Germany produced approximately 94,000 aircraft total. Japan produced approximately 76,000 combat aircraft. American aircraft production exceeded the combined Axis total substantially, but numbers alone understate American advantages. American aircraft were generally more durable, carried more ammunition, possessed better equipment, were maintained by better trained ground crews supplied with unlimited spare parts. An F4F Wildcat destroyed in combat was replaced within days. A Japanese Zero destroyed might not be replaced for months due to production bottlenecks and material shortages. American pilot training similarly emphasized quality over quantity. The United States trained approximately 193,000 pilots during World War II from over 317,000 cadets who entered training. Washout rates remained above 39% even during pilot shortages. The system prioritized quality, understanding that poorly trained pilots died quickly without achieving objectives. Japan was forced to reduce training standards as losses mounted. By 1944, Japanese pilots entered combat with less than 100 hours total flight time, compared to Swett's 450 hours before enlistment plus extensive military training. Japanese pilots died in their first missions, unable to survive against experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft. This created a death spiral where Japan's experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be trained, leading to declining pilot quality, higher losses, accelerated decline. America continuously produced well-trained, confident pilots flying increasingly superior aircraft backed by unlimited logistics. Yet even with these advantages, men like James Swett still had to face enemy fire and risk death. Courage alone was insufficient, but it remained essential. The America that James Swett returned to after the war had been transformed by total mobilization. The economy had exploded from depression stagnation to full employment and booming production. New industries had been created virtually overnight. The nation had discovered capabilities it hadn't known it possessed. This transformation was particularly evident to combat veterans returning from overseas. They had witnessed American military power abroad, now returned to see American economic power at home, creating unprecedented prosperity. The two were connected. The same industrial capacity that built aircraft could build automobiles. The same organizational skills that coordinated military logistics could coordinate domestic supply chains. The same engineering expertise that designed weapons could design consumer products. The pump company Swett operated exemplified this. Small scale, locally owned, technically sophisticated, reliably profitable. Thousands of such companies across America produced components and equipment that sustained the economy. They weren't glamorous, but they were essential. Swett's decision to return to his father's business reflected his values. He had never sought fame. The Medal of Honor was appreciated but not defining. What mattered was doing useful work, providing for family, contributing to community. These modest aspirations characterized millions of World War II veterans who returned home and quietly built post-war prosperity. They went back to work, raised families, paid taxes, participated in civic life without demanding special treatment. The greatest generation earned its title not through combat heroism alone, but through the collective decision to build rather than complain, to contribute rather than demand, to focus on the future rather than dwell on the past. Swett's school speeches emphasized values more than combat. He told students that success came from preparation and hard work, that security came from competence, that respect came from responsibility. He rarely mentioned killing enemy pilots except when directly asked. There was no glorification of violence, no triumphalism, no hatred of former enemies. By the 1980s, American attitudes toward World War II had evolved. The war was increasingly seen as morally unambiguous, clearly justified, successfully concluded. Veterans were honored as heroes, their service appreciated, their sacrifices recognized. This represented significant change from earlier decades when World War II was taken for granted. Colonel James Swett's funeral in 2009 brought closure to a life spanning nearly 9 decades, witnessing America's transformation from Depression uncertainty to 21st century superpower status. Swett was born in 1920 when the United States was still recovering from World War I. He died in 2009 when America was the unquestioned global hegemon. That transformation required the efforts of millions, but men like Swett had been essential contributors. His 15 minutes of combat on April 7, 1943, represented a tiny fraction of the vast American war effort. Yet thousands of similar actions collectively overwhelmed Japanese forces. They faced not just skilled pilots, but an entire system designed to produce skilled pilots continuously, supply them with excellent aircraft constantly, support them with logistics unfailingly. The system enabled heroism but didn't create it. James Swett's decision to continue attacking without ammunition was individual choice, not systematic programming. His survival of ditching was personal resilience, not organizational design. His decades of post-war service were character traits developed through upbringing, not learned military behaviors. The system provided opportunity. Swett provided courage and competence. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. The story of James Elms Swett resonates across generations because it embodies values Americans recognize as fundamentally their own: individual initiative rather than blind obedience, personal responsibility rather than dependence on authority, technical competence valued over social status, humble service rather than self-promotion, quiet courage rather than bombast. Swett represented millions of ordinary Americans who accomplished extraordinary things when circumstances demanded. He insisted he had simply done his job. But in doing that job superbly, he and thousands like him defeated powerful enemies, defended civilization, created foundations for decades of peace and prosperity. The America Swett defended in 1943 was imperfect, with significant domestic problems including racial segregation and economic inequality. But it also represented hope for oppressed peoples worldwide, offered opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth, combined individual liberty with collective purpose more successfully than previous societies. The fact that a working man could become a fighter ace, earn the nation's highest military decoration, then return home to run his father's business without ceremony, illustrated the egalitarian character distinguishing America from class-bound societies and totalitarian powers. James Swett never sought to become a symbol. He would have preferred to remain anonymous, another pilot doing his part without recognition. But history thrust symbolism upon him. His Medal of Honor made him a public figure. His extraordinary first mission made him a legend. His humble post-war life made him a model. Accepting these roles with grace became another form of service. When the History Channel asked him to participate in recreating his combat mission, Swett could have declined. Instead, he participated fully, providing detailed information, ensuring accuracy, because he believed younger generations should understand what their predecessors accomplished. On a hillside in Northern California, a gravestone marks Colonel James Elms Swett's resting place. The stone lists his name, rank, dates, and the Medal of Honor. It doesn't detail his achievements. The stone is simple, dignified. Nearby rest other veterans. Some died in combat. Some lived long lives, all served. The cemetery represents equality in death, where all rest together without distinction. James Swett would have appreciated that equality. He never sought special treatment, never demanded recognition based on decorations. The values Swett lived by were simple. Do your job well. Support your teammates. Maintain your equipment. Accept responsibility. Honor your commitments. These were working-class values, learned in machine shops, applied in combat and business with equal validity. They were practical and proven. 88 years after his birth in Seattle, 66 years after his 15 minutes over Guadalcanal, James Elms Swett's life ended. His story survives because it matters, not because it was unique, but because it was typical. Thousands of young Americans like James Swett answered their nation's call, performed beyond expectation, returned home without demanding special recognition. They built post-war prosperity, raised families, contributed to communities. Their collective achievement was monumental. Their individual modesty was remarkable. The combination defined a generation. The final lesson of James Swett's life is simple. Ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when preparation meets opportunity and courage. Swett was not superhuman. He was trained, equipped, motivated. The system prepared him. The situation challenged him. His character sustained him. The results were extraordinary, but the process was comprehensible. Any young person with similar training, equipment, and character might achieve similar results. That was the real secret of American success. Not superior humans, but superior systems. Not natural warriors, but trained soldiers properly equipped. Not innate advantages, but developed capabilities. The formula was repeatable and sustainable. It produced victory in World War II and continued producing success in subsequent challenges. James Elms Swett died in 2009 as the last members of the greatest generation gradually departed. His passing marked the end of one man's journey, but the continuation of values he embodied: courage and humility, competence and modesty, service and citizenship. These values remain as relevant today as in 1943. Technology changes, threats evolve, challenges differ. But fundamental character traits that enabled Swett's generation to triumph remain timeless. In recognizing James Swett's achievements, we honor an entire generation. In studying his life, we learn lessons applicable to our times. In preserving his memory, we ensure future generations understand what their predecessors accomplished and what values sustained those accomplishments. A working man became a hero. The hero returned to being a working man. The circle completed itself. That was the American way, the democratic ideal distinguishing America from militaristic societies. Service when needed, humility always, useful work as the highest calling. Colonel James Elms Swett wouldn't have asked for more elaborate tribute than this recounting of his life and service. He was, after all, simply doing his job to the best of his ability, which turned out to be extraordinary. Because sometimes that's all it takes. One person, one moment, one decision to keep fighting when everyone would understand if you turned away. 15 minutes that changed everything. Not just for James Swett, but for the sailors in Tulagi Harbor who lived because 7 Japanese bombers never reached them. For the Marines who landed on islands that might have been reinforced if American air superiority hadn't been maintained. For the families who got their sons and husbands and fathers back because pilots like Swett stood between them and the enemy. The fuel hose that disconnected with a metallic click on April 7, 1943, started something that echoed far beyond Henderson Field, far beyond the Solomon Islands, far beyond the Pacific War itself. It started a story about what ordinary people can do when their nation needs them, about what courage looks like when it's not looking for glory, about what heroism means when the hero just wants to go home and work on pumps. James Swett climbed into that cockpit as a mechanic who happened to know how to fly. He emerged from the water off Tulagi as something else entirely. Not better than he was before, not fundamentally changed, just proven. The courage was always there. The skill was always there. The determination was always there. The situation simply revealed what had been present all along, and maybe that's the most important lesson. That heroes aren't made in combat. They're revealed. That the extraordinary capabilities exist in ordinary people all around us. That the difference between someone who does nothing and someone who does everything isn't some innate superiority. It's just circumstance, preparation, and choice. Swett chose to keep attacking without ammunition, chose to stay in the fight when his aircraft was damaged, chose to return to combat after ditching twice, chose to serve quietly after the war instead of trading on his fame, chose to emphasize values over victories when speaking to young people. Every choice consistent with a character formed long before Pearl Harbor. In a machine shop in San Francisco, where a young man learned that you do the job right, you take care of your equipment, you support your team, and you don't quit until the work is done. Those lessons served him well at 14,000 feet over the Russell Islands. They served him well in the decades that followed. They serve as lessons still, for anyone willing to listen, for anyone who understands that the greatest achievements often come from the simplest principles, applied consistently, without compromise. Without fanfare, the sky over Guadalcanal is peaceful now. The waters off Tulagi Harbor are calm. The Japanese aircraft that fell that day are long since corroded away. The Wildcat that carried James Swett into battle rests somewhere on the ocean floor, rusted, silent, forgotten by everyone except historians and the man who flew it. But the story remains. The legend persists. The lesson endures. 15 minutes, 7 kills, 1 ace, 1 Medal of Honor, 1 life that mattered not because it was unique, but because it was exemplary. James Elms Swett. Born in Seattle, died in Reading. In between, he did his job, and in doing his job, he showed an entire generation what was possible, what was necessary, what was expected. The greatest generation earned that title one person at a time, one mission at a time, one choice at a time. James Swett made his choices on April 7, 1943, and every day thereafter. The fuel hose disconnected. The engine started. The Wildcat climbed. And a mechanic from San Francisco became part of history. Not because he sought it, but because when his moment came, he was ready, trained, equipped, and willing to do whatever was necessary. That's the legacy. That's the lesson. That's why we remember. Not to glorify war, not to romanticize combat, but to honor the ordinary people who did extraordinary things when their nation needed them. And then went home. Back to the machine shops and the farms and the factories. Back to the quiet work of building a better world. Back to being ordinary again, except they were never really ordinary. Not before, not during, not after. They were Americans, and when the moment demanded it, that was enough. James Elms. Swett proved it. 15 minutes at a time,